Hello, grade 10, and welcome to our new PowerPoint lecture. This week we're going to move to literature. Our first genre in literature would be short story, and the short story we're going to take this time is called The Story of an Hour. It is found on pages 44 through 50 in your comprehension and literature ebook, along with the explanations and everything. So let's begin. First of all, what is literature? Before we start studying it, we need to know what it actually is. Literature is most commonly refers to works of the creative imagination, including poetry, drama, plays, fiction, stories, made-up stories, non-fiction, writing real stories, and in some instances, journalism and song. Those are all related to literature. People read these things and they are entertained by them. So the genre or type of literature that we will begin with is called short stories. The people you see here are, of course, very famous writers. Here you have Shakespeare, father of English literature, Charles Dickens, and the poet, the very, very famous poet and writer Sylvia Plath, and of course here you have Oscar Wilde, all very famous literature writers. So what is a short story? A short story is a piece of fiction writing, meaning it's imagined and not real, that can be typically read in one sitting and focuses on a self-contained incident, specific incident, or series of linked incidents with the intent of evoking a single effect or mood. Written in the 19th century, in the year 1894, The Story of an Hour is considered one of the most famous short stories. This is why I chose it for you. Who wrote The Story of an Hour? Her name is Kate Chopin. She was born Catherine O'Flaherty, February 8, 1850, and she died on August 22, 1904. She was an American author of short stories. She is now considered by some scholars to have been a forerunner of American 20th century feminist writers, meaning she was working in the 19th century, but the work she did was a beginning of what will continue to be in the 20th century, meaning in the 1900s, what feminists are people who ask for women's rights. They don't have to be only women. Of course, some men are considered feminists because they ask that women should be given their human rights. So Chopin's major works were two short story collections, Bayou Folk and A Night in Acadie. Her important short stories included Desiree's Baby, A Tale of Miscegenation in Antebellum, Louisiana, The Story of an Hour, the one we're reading now, and The Storm, etc. She also wrote two novels, At Fault and The Awakening. The Awakening, of course, a very famous story of hers. It's a novel, it's not a short story, it's a book, which both are set in New Orleans in the US. So, before we read a short story, before we go on and read any piece of literature, it's important to recognize some literary devices, or as we know them, figures of speech. They both refer to the same thing, figures of speech, in order to be able to understand and analyze the short story in depth. The literary devices, or if you want, the figures of speech required for this lesson, in order for you to understand this lesson better, are the following: simile, you've taken them before, metaphor, personification, and irony. Of course, I'm going to go through those in great detail. Irony may be the only one that you haven't really learned in detail, but this is what we're going to take this year, of course. Now, the figures of speech, we start with simile, metaphor, and personification. Both similes and metaphors are forms of comparison that compare two different things in one sentence. They can be used to make your sentences more interesting. This is generally why we use those literary devices to make our text or our story or our essay more attractive to the reader. So how are similes and metaphors different? They both compare things, but how are they different? A simile is a word that compares two things in a sentence. You can usually tell if it's a simile when you have as or like. Simile, okay, compares two things using the words as or like. Don ate his salad like a vacuum cleaner. We're describing Don. We are comparing him to a vacuum cleaner by using the word like. His arms were weak and felt like noodles. We are comparing his arms to noodles. The thunder was as loud as fireworks. We're comparing the loudness of thunder to fireworks. Now, moving on, what is a metaphor? A metaphor compares two different things in a sentence. However, instead of saying that something is like another or as another, a metaphor speaks about one thing as if it were something else. A metaphor can sometimes use words such as is, are, was, and other words to signal that a metaphor is present. However, a metaphor never uses like or as to compare. Let's take this first example. The smoke was cotton balls billowing from the chimney. The smoke was. We didn't say the smoke was like cotton balls. Okay? We speak of it as if it were cotton balls. You are my hero. Not you are like my hero. You are my hero. I spoke to him as if he were my hero. The sun was a furnace. A furnace is like an oven with fire, with a lot of fire. This is where you would find this in a bakery. The sun was a furnace, not like a furnace. When I say the sun was like a furnace here, I am using a simile, but in this case, of course, it's a metaphor. His heart was a rock. Not was like a rock, his heart was a rock. So this is the difference between a simile and a metaphor. Now, personification, as the word implies, it's a figure of speech where the author gives human qualities and human characteristics to non-human things. Okay, I'm sitting on my desk now and there are so many books and there's the tablet and there's the phone. My desk is screaming from the load. Okay, who screams? Humans scream. So I'm giving my desk characteristics and qualities of humans. I'm personifying my desk. Look at my car. She's a beauty, isn't she? Okay, the car is not a person. I can't, when I speak to her as a beauty, obviously I am personifying her or I'm personifying it. The wind whispered through the thin grass. The wind does not whisper, it makes a sound. But when I speak of it as whispering, I'm giving it human qualities. The fire swallowed the entire forest. The fire does not have a mouth, okay, does not have teeth, but when I say that, I am, of course, giving it person characteristics. Now we come to this figure of speech called irony. Now, by definition, it's important to know the definition. By definition, irony is a contrast between what is expected and what actually happens, okay? Let's take a look at the three types in order for you to understand it better. Types of irony. You have the situational irony. Something happens that we wouldn't expect to happen. For example, a fire station burns down. This is a strange situation. A fire station is supposed to be used with the water in it to put out fires in places. The fire station burning down. A policeman who breaks the law. Again, this is situational irony, a strange situation, ironic situation. A doctor who is sick. A marriage counselor who wants a divorce. Okay, you counsel people and then you are going through a divorce. Posting on Facebook how useless you think social media is. You're using social media to post how useless it is. Okay, so all those are types of situational irony. For example, a butcher who does not eat meat. That's an example of situational irony. Now, dramatic irony, which is very important for the lesson we're going to take today, the reader knows something that the characters do not. Be careful when you read the story of an hour. For example, in Home Alone, we know that Kevin has planted traps everywhere, but the thieves don't. This is dramatic irony. The audience knows and it's happy that those thieves are going to get really beat up, but the thieves do not. Dramatic irony. It's used in drama, in acting. In a movie, for example, the character buys a new house he thinks is nice, while the audience already knows that the house is haunted, like the haunted houses we see a lot these days in movies. Okay, the audience knows it's dramatic irony, but unfortunately the characters do not. In a play, the bride is waiting for her groom when the audience knows that he was just shot dead by the mafia. Dramatic irony. We know as the audience, but the characters do not know about it. Now, verbal irony. Verbal irony, as the word suggests, verbal, what you speak, what you say. What is said is different from what is meant. We use this a lot as humans. For example, the teacher hands in a 3 out of 10 grade to a student and she says, I am proud of you. Of course, the teacher is being ironic here. She is expressing verbal irony in words. A boy refuses to jump into the pool and his friends tell him that he is so brave. Of course, they are being ironic, saying something while meaning something else. So those are the 3 types of irony. Now we come to the story of an hour by Kate Chopin. And please listen to the reading. The Story of an Hour, Kate Chopin. Knowing that Mrs. Millar was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. It was her sister Josephine who told her, in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half concealing. Her husband's friend Richards was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence or news of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Millard's name leading the list of killed. Of course, Brentley Millard is Mrs. Millard's husband. And she had heart trouble. She had problems with her heart. He had only taken the time to assure himself of the truth by a second telegram and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. So he has news for Mrs. Millar about her husband's death. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept, meaning she cried. She wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief, extreme sadness, had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. So she heard of her husband's news, she wept into her sister's arms, and then she said, I'm going to go to my room, no one follow me, please. So she saw this armchair, comfortable armchair in her room, and she decided to sink into it. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. Aquiver means that they're alive. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. Guys, notice those statements here. Okay, she is grieving, supposedly grieving her husband's death, but look at what she's looking at. A quiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares, meaning, when people go by your house and they say we have things for sale, we have batteries for sale, oranges, bananas, etc. This is what they mean by crying, shouting. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing, again, reached her faintly, and countless sparrows are birds, were twittering in the eaves. Eaves, the roofs. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west, facing her window. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob, a loud cry, came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. So she was crying heavily, crying loudly. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it. Be careful with this part. She felt that there was something coming for her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? So she's suddenly having those, gut feelings, weird feelings. She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name. But she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching towards her. Through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Okay, you notice here there is some sort of personification, something creeping out the sky, reaching towards her. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her. Possess her means something that was about to take her. And she was striving to beat it back with her will. What could this thing be, guys? Think. What could this be foreshadowing? What was creeping towards her and something wanting to possess her and take her? As powerless as her two white slender hands would have been. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. Okay, why would she say free, free, free? Free of what? I mean, we learned that her husband just died. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy. So she was feeling this sort of joy that was a bit guilty for her. Was she a monster? A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. So she was happy. She knew that she would weep again, cry again, when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. When she saw his body folded, his hands folded against his chest, she would cry again, of course. The face that had never looked save with love upon her, so meaning that her husband did love her, fixed and gray and dead. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. So she would be living for herself and not for anyone else. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome, to those years of freedom, as she thought. There would be no one to live for her during these coming years. She would live for herself. Again, some selfish thoughts from Mrs. Mallard. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime, as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. And yet she had loved him, sometimes. Often she had not, so she's describing her feelings towards her late husband. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? So what Mrs. Millar is describing is being trapped in this marriage, and suddenly she was free. She had all the freedom in the world to live for herself. Again, free, body and soul, free, she kept whispering. Josephine, her sister, was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door. Louise is Mrs. Millar's name. Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. Of course, what Louise thought was that Mrs. Millar was sobbing and crying because she was sad. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. Now Louise says, go away. I'm not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through the open window. So she opened the window and she was breathing life in. She was breathing her newfound freedom. Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her, spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. Okay, notice? She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. She wanted to live this freedom, to live a long life where she was alone. It was only yesterday, she had thought with a shudder, that life might be long. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, triumph, victory, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. She felt proud, she felt happy. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. They went down the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Brentley Millard. It was her husband. He was alive, who entered, a little travel-stained, composedly carrying his grip sack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of the accident and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. He wanted to hide him so that Mrs. Millar would not be in shock. They know she has a weak heart. But Richard's was too late. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills. Okay, a strange story, a strange plot twist at the end, totally unexpected. The first time I read it, I was really in shock for like an amount of time. But notice how the doctors that came and saw her and said that she was dead, they thought that she died because of joy. While we know very well as the audience, notice the dramatic irony here, as the audience we know very well that she died because she was feeling all this happiness, and then her husband walks in, and then she was extremely sad that she was still alive and just shockingly died. Now the discussion questions for The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. What ailment did Mrs. Millar suffer from? What disease did she have? Of course, she had a weak heart, as stated in the story. 2. Describe Mrs. Millar's reaction to the death of her husband. Why do you think she felt that way? At first, we noticed she was, we thought she was sad, she sobbed loudly, etc. But then, as the scene unveiled, we noticed how she felt that she was free. She was going to live a long life for herself, on her own. She was experiencing freedom, etc. 3. What view of marriage is portrayed in this story? Can this view still apply today? Okay, we see how Mrs. Millard felt that she was trapped in this marriage. She was exalted that it's over now, that her husband is dead. But can this view be applied today in the West? Let's talk about the West. This is a story that took place in the West. Okay, in the West, maybe a woman wouldn't have to feel this trapped, okay, and a marriage maybe could end, a relationship could end. She wouldn't have to feel trapped. Let's take a look at the answers here. Of course, please stop the video or go through the PowerPoint and read the answers very carefully. Obviously here, the Mallard marriage was a traditional one. Of course, it was fixed. Let's not forget that it was set in the 19th century, in the 1800s, there where women's rights weren't upheld yet. She didn't even have the right to vote. She was generally trapped. This view might still apply in some areas of the world, but definitely not in the West, where marriage and personal status of women have really come a long way from what they were in those days. A woman would feel trapped in the West. She wouldn't stay in the marriage generally. She wouldn't have to stay because the laws on personal status, on her personal status, have changed a lot in her favor. Literary devices. Now we come to the figures of speech. What figure of speech is used in the paragraph below? Explain. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her as a child who cried. So, of course, this is a simile, comparing Mrs. Mallard to a child that had cried itself to sleep. Okay, this is the answer here. And when you tell me it's a simile, you have to please explain. The author says, tell me where the simile is. You write it, and the author compares Mrs. Mallard to a child using the word as. You have to explain the figure of speech. Number 2, what do you think this paragraph in the story signifies? What was coming towards Mrs. Mallard? It's very important. There was something coming to her and she was waiting for it. Okay, read the paragraph. This is the paragraph here. Fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching towards her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. So, answer. The way the author described it, it seems that this was foreshadowing the death, predicting her death for us. Okay, creeping, the words like creeping towards her, wanting to possess her. Okay, death takes a person away. She says there was something coming to her and she was waiting for it fearfully. I don't think she was speaking about her freedom here. She had this strange feeling in her gut. She had this intuition. She did not quite understand that feeling. Also, when the author says she felt it creeping out of the sky and reaching towards her, she was personifying, the author was personifying that feeling that engulfed Mrs. Mallard, giving it personal qualities, reaching towards her, creeping. Okay? The irony in the story of an hour, this is the most important question. I discussed it at the beginning, but be careful. What type of irony was used in the story? And this is the answer here. The irony used in the story is dramatic irony. In the end of the story, Mrs. Mallard realizes that her husband had not died in the accident as she had earlier been informed. Mr. Mallard walks through the door just as Louise and her sister had descended the staircase to join Richards. On seeing her husband, Louise dies, and the doctors argue that she had died of joy that kills. She was so happily shocked to see him that her heart failed. This is dramatic irony because we know, the audience knows very well, that Mrs. Mallard had died of discovering that her husband was still alive and that this had saddened her because the freedom she was fantasizing about when she thought he was dead would remain only imaginary. So there is the dramatic irony. Of course, you can write it in a different way. You can write about the plot twist, the irony. Another irony in the story would be that supposedly Mr. Mallard was dead, In the end of the story, he was alive, and Mrs. Malar, who was craving her newfound freedom, suddenly died. So I do like this story, one of my favorite short stories. We're going to read more of this level, okay, more famous writers, awesome writers. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will discuss it, of course, later in Zoom Live. Meanwhile, take care and bye.